Welcome, everyone. Welcome, Dr. Victoria Jackson. As per the information that has been sent out, Dr. Jackson is a forensic psychiatrist and also an adjunct senior lecturer with Monash University. She's done a lot of work, and her passion for justice for women, especially within the mental health system and also within the justice system, is just amazing. We I heard a lot about this research through the work we were doing together, but also through running together the back and forth between Dr. Jackson's work and their supervisor. I'm sure for those who've done a thesis, you can recall the number of time your supervisor sends things back, and I was the other side on the ear of Dr. Jackson when her work was being sent back and forth. And it's good to finally get to see and hear all about it, but not from a running perspective, as she was talking about it when we were running a lot. So the work that Dr. Jackson has touched on or is going to share with us today is, I think, very well timed, especially given the challenges that we faced as a justice system, especially recently with the case that was within the coroner system or the coroner's courts, where good demonstration of the challenges that women face, as much as they are fewer in numbers compared to men within the justice system, but they do have unique challenges, and most of those are trauma related. I think, in the words of one specialist, is that women coming into the system just long enough to disrupt all the grassroots or the foundation that they have in the community, but not long enough to establish long-term support services. So I think this is well timed, and it's something that we as a service, especially those within the specialist courts, that we 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 we, we find it challenging, especially when trying to find those services that can take on our court users long term, to make sure that they are safe and their families are safe, and also addressing that trauma. So this research, I think, without going into too much again, yes, it says serious offenders, but it will apply to most of the work that we do within magistrate court as well. So I'll hand over to Dr. Jackson, and we hope we'll be able to have enough time for question and answers. And if you've got any direct questions, also feel free to pop them onto the chat, and we'll try and go through that. Um, Over to you, Dr. Jackson.
Thank you. And just before I proceed, in addition to what Anne was saying, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the country of the Muwinina and Palawa people, here in Lutruwina, Tasmania. So I know that I'm speaking to a diverse group here, and that I don't know most of you. So I'm really hoping that today I won't be teaching you how to suck eggs, but you're welcome to write letters of complaint. I also want to just acknowledge openly the challenges of delivering a presentation online, where it's more difficult to take the temperature of the room. At the moment, I can only see myself, Anne, Keith, and Rebecca. So the rest of you are all welcome to check your phones, Instagram, Facebook, or finish your lunch. but hopefully I'll be able to keep a bit of interest over the course of the next little while. And yeah, I'll try and leave some time for questions. But I'd also be really happy to speak to people who have an interest in this topic outside of the presentation. So today I'm going to talk to you about the topics surrounding a study that I did a couple of years ago, which was looking at trauma-informed sentencing. And I particularly looked at serious violent offenders, but like Keith was saying, this is a subject that is so relevant to, the vast majority of people who we see through, justice settings. So we're going to talk a little bit around the theoretical background of trauma-informed sentencing and just understand what I mean by that. I'm going to glance over the case law, acknowledge that the case law exists, and give you a little insight into the research that we did, and try not to kill you with statistics, and then talk a little bit about what we can make of that research. So first of all, if we're thinking about what we define as trauma, there are various definitions that we work with, and these are the topic of some debate, certainly amongst the clinical circles that I work in, and also with respect to the sorts of trauma that's significant when we're thinking about offending. Here are just a few examples of ways that trauma has been described. So distinct, uncontrollable, terrifying life events, events that could lead to the development of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, according to the DSM, which is the diagnostic manual which sort of defines many of the disorders that we talk about in psychiatry and psychology, or emotional and physiological consequences of repeated or prolonged exposure to such stimuli. And this can describe things like complex trauma or developmental trauma. This doesn't even go close to describing the range of trauma that we understand to be significant. If you think about the work of people like Francine Shapiro, who developed the eye movement, see, I'm doing it to you, the eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy, EMDR, and she talked about concepts of big T and small t trauma, and the big T trauma being the stuff that we usually think about as being trauma, the kind of assaults and car crashes and blam blam. And small t trauma being the sort of dripping trauma, which doesn't necessarily get the same amount of attention. A lot of that's to do with relational trauma and attachment trauma, experiences that might be of low intensity but go on over a long period of time. So bullying is a very good example of that. Children who find themselves marginalised over a prolonged period where nothing dramatic happens, but it's still really damaging nonetheless. That's the small t trauma, which we actually understand increasingly is in many ways more significant with respect to your psychological consequences than big T trauma. And also there are the other sort of ideas about neglect and the absence of things rather than the presence of things constituting trauma. With respect to offending, so some of you will have a sort of understanding of criminogenic needs, which are traditionally outlined by Andrews and Bonta. They were Canadians who did a lot of this work, as being the central variables that make you likely to offend, of which trauma isn't one. However, we know that trauma is related to offending. Statistically, it's definitely related to offending. Some studies will tell you that around about 90% of juveniles going into criminal justice settings have been exposed to trauma. So the question is not so much whether trauma is a criminogenic factor, but more how it's a criminogenic, or how it relates to offending, rather. And so we know that it's related to initial offending, and there also seems to be a relationship with recidivism, so reoffending. But the nature of that relationship is quite variable depending on which paper you're reading. What I think is really important for you to take from this presentation is that it's not PTSD that is significant, it's the trauma experiences. So although PTSD is something that's highly prevalent in the populations that we work with, it's actually those developmental experiences which make people more likely to offend, and particularly in my study to engage in violent offending. This study considers the gendered perspective on offending, and of course, it will come as no surprise to understand that the types of trauma that people experience differs depending on their gender. So when we're talking about men are more likely to witness violence or be victims of violent abuse. They're more likely to be involved in accidents and more of those sorts of impulsive risk-taking associated traumas. And they're more likely to exhibit externalizing behavior, namely violence. Women, on the other hand, are more likely to experience higher rates of abuse. They're more likely to be polyvictimized, that they experience various different types of abuse, and they're more likely to be sexually victimized. And then there's this idea of gendered pathways. Was that on this slide or was that on the next one? That's on this one. And so this considers whether or not men and women become offenders along the same pathway. So I mentioned before the central 8 criminogenic needs that we're familiar with. So the antisociality, drug abuse, community variables. Whereas the gendered pathways perspective posits that women, or a substantial proportion of women, go into offending through a different pathway, this gendered pathway. And this pathway is meant to represent more of a trauma-related pathway into offending, whereby women end up offending as a survival strategy in many cases, or as a byproduct of avoiding further traumatization. So, for example, young girls who are running away from home because of family violence, who end up in situations where they become offenders, women who find themselves in the protection of violent men and they end up participating in offending as a result of those, those relationships. The relationship between gender and this trajectory into offending is not necessarily straightforward. Jones in 2014 did an analysis looking at men and women and the pathways that they took, and what they found was that about 50% of women offend along this gendered trajectory, and about 50% follow the classical pathway of criminogenic needs. Similarly, when they looked at men, they found that about 25% of men follow a trajectory which is similar to the gender trajectory, so something that's more survival and trauma avoidant in its nature. However, I do think it's important for us to think about these differences and to think about the gendered differences, of offenders that we're encountering, because what we do understand and what the data over the last decade and more has shown is that the rate of incarceration and criminal justice contact is disproportionately increasing for women compared to men. So the statistics that I have to hand, which are slightly out of date now, but still it's kind of the same story, show that the women and the increase in sentenced offenders in prison has increased for women, so 38% increase compared to about 30% for men, and also community corrections, there was about a 44% increase in the 5 years up until 2019 versus 34% in men. And the reason for this is complex and probably another talk's worth, but there's a variety of factors like global factors, wars, economy, changes, COVID, the seriousness of the offending that women are engaging in having changed, and also changes in judicial culture where there are more severe judicial responses for offences which might account for this change. But women, even though they only make up about 8% of incarcerated offenders, something is changing there which is interesting to consider. We also need to think about trauma as an outcome of offending when we're considering trauma-informed criminal justice. Just as trauma is associated with offending, we also know that the prison environment itself can be a re-traumatizing place, and that perpetrators of violence experience perpetrator trauma, which is something that you have to delicately address, because obviously the victims of violence are traumatized as well. There was a quote from one of the articles, and there was a list of references at the end of the talk, which I'll share. But Miller and Nadjevitz wrote a really interesting article in 2012 thinking about correctional trauma-informed responses. And they illustrated, I thought, quite nicely, prisons are designed to house perpetrators, not victims. Inmates arrive shackled and are crammed into overcrowded housing units. Lights are on all night, loudspeakers blare without warning, and privacy is severely limited. Security staff is focused on maintaining order and must assume each inmate is potentially violent. The correctional environment is full of unavoidable triggers such as pat-downs and strip searches, frequent discipline from authority figures, and restricted movement. So you can understand how that sort of experience would be parallel to many experiences, particularly of childhood trauma, that offenders might have might bring with them. Now, trauma and mental illness is a very, almost every mental illness you can think of can be correlated with trauma. So there's an enormous and diverse body of evidence which links these phenomena, which I'm going to defer for today because, again, it would be a whole other talk. But clearly trauma-related mental illnesses are more prevalent in justice settings. So now we're going to just come on to this concept of trauma-informed sentencing. What is trauma-informed sentencing? So in recognition of this relationship between trauma, offending, and mental illness, the trauma-informed approach seeks to better attend to the fullness of the diffused effects of a traumatic incident. That is, it acknowledges the complex influences of past trauma on offenders and their victims, and it responds in a way that avoids re-traumatization and reduces harm. And this second point is particularly important when we consider that offenders with a history of victimization are also more likely to abuse their own children. So there might be longitudinal opportunities to prevent the onset of offending in subsequent generations by supporting parents who have got trauma histories. Trauma-informed sentencing, there are sort of four large components to trauma-informed sentencing when we're thinking about it. The first one is the recognition that the trauma exists, and recognising not just the trauma that's directly affecting the offender, but also their dependents, victims, and people who work with them, considering concepts of vicarious trauma, which is something that we need to be aware of, and people in correctional settings and at all points along the process need to be aware of. It's understanding the importance of trauma at all stages of the criminal justice process. It's a focus on legal representation that adequately explores, acknowledges, and represents the individualized presence and relevance of trauma to offending, and we'll talk about that as well. And it's seeking specialist recommendations for evidence-based interventions. So it's not just acknowledging that the trauma is there, but it's also putting some onus on the courts to find ways of addressing this. And here's the concept of therapeutic jurisprudence, which is the theory and application of practices which recognise the role of the law as an agent to nurture the well-being of society. So rather than courts being places of consequential punishment, they actually become places that nurture some sort of rehabilitation and recovery. And I liked this excerpt from King wrote a paper in 2006 titled Therapeutic Jurisprudence, and quoted Judge Roger Warren about what therapeutic jurisprudence signifies. So instead of being adversarial, it's collaborative. Instead of being case or problem-oriented, it's people-oriented. Instead of being rights-based, it's needs-based. Instead of being the pure application of law, it's concerned with the application of social science. Instead of being backward-looking to precedent, it's forward-looking and planning-based. And rather than being legalistic, it's commonsensical. There are also real benefits to trauma-informed sentencing. And I think, it's been reflected back to me that trauma-informed is something that we hear a lot about recently, even since I, wrote this paper. The kind of phrase trauma-informed has become much more ubiquitous in day-to-day working life. And I think that the danger of that is that even though it's becoming part of our parlance and it's something that people are more aware of, there's also a bit of a danger that people gloss over, and I think that all of us, or glaze over rather, glaze or gloss. I think all of us can think about times when we've, heard particular phrases that make our eyes roll into the backs of our heads, and I think that sometimes there's a danger that the overuse of one particular term can do that. So I think that actually taking away from the more compassionate perspective and thinking about the practical perspective can be really helpful when we're talking about trauma-informed justice. So, one of the key factors is related to the conditions of those who are imprisoned after trauma-informed sentencing takes place. So we know that the early hours and days in prison are a high-risk time for offenders, and so actually identifying that there's trauma-related issues, needs, pathology, allows us to respond to that from the get-go rather than waiting for adverse outcomes. We also know that people who have trauma-related pathology, whether it's PTSD or the plethora of illnesses that I listed before, will struggle to respond to correctional rehabilitation. They're going to be less responsive than people who are not traumatized. And so actually, if you're going to put somebody in a program, then they're going to be able to engage better in that program if it's being delivered in a way that's not triggering them and re-traumatizing them and causing them to be in a state of heightened arousal by which their thinking brain goes offline and they go back into that sort of fight or flight position where they can't actually take in or integrate information. We've talked a bit about the transgenerational implications of trauma, and also, and I think this is really important, there's the consideration of the improved health and welfare of people who are working with offenders to consider. So there's data that shows that the use of trauma-informed correctional care reduces vicarious trauma, it reduces unhelpful countertransferences, and by that, I mean just the way that guards, officers respond to offenders, reduces overwhelm and burnout. And I think that that's a really significant consideration. And it also moves correctional management away from a more sort of reactionary management style to being something that's much more stable. And is the only environment where people who have experienced developmental trauma particularly can recover. They need to be in a stable environment. That's something that all of the information, all of the literature tells us. So I said that I would give a bit of a nod towards the case law. The most important case for you to be aware of in this little list is Bugmy. And I expect that many of you have encountered Bugmy. So Bugmy was an Aboriginal man who was subjected to abuse, neglect, alcohol abuse in his home during his upbringing. And he was sentenced by the New South Wales District Court for assaulting a prison officer. And the case was appealed before the High Court of Australia. And the High Court determined that his background moderated the general deterrence principle of sentencing and needed to be balanced against other principles such as rehabilitation. And in a quote from the sentencing transcript, the judge said that the experience of growing up in an environment surrounded by alcohol abuse and violence may leave its mark on a person throughout life. Among other things, a background of that kind may compromise the person's capacity to mature and to learn from experience. It is a feature of the person's makeup and remains relevant to the determination of an appropriate sentence, notwithstanding that the person has a long history of offending. So that's one of the cases that will come up, and certainly in my own study, Bugmy was cited in a number of the cases. In order for a history of trauma to mitigate sentencing, there have to be some conditions. So the court must accept that the abuse occurred and establish a connection between that and the current offending, between the trauma and the current offending, which diminishes the offender's moral culpability. I will gloss over this. This was really just the research that was pre-existing when we did our study, which in summary was not very much. Most of the literature surrounded, just particularly interested in looking at adults. So let's, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the study that I did, which again was largely written in 2019, 2020. And so in preparation for this talk, I had to go back through it all and remind myself what it was that we did and make sense of the statistics again, which is a bit challenging for somebody like me because I'm not very mathematically minded. Anyway, so what we wanted to do was we wanted to examine sentencing transcripts to establish whether or not trauma experiences were being acknowledged during sentencing and whether such traumatic experiences influence the sentencing outcomes. So sentencing transcripts, as you'll know, are published on OSTLE and they detail the summaries of sentencing decisions. So what I wanted to know was what sorts of trauma were coming up in these sentencing transcripts, what was being described, and then harking back to these principles of trauma-informed justice, whether or not these trauma were being explicitly acknowledged as trauma. I then wanted to know whether or not that made a difference to the sentencing outcomes and whether or not trauma-informed recommendations were being made. So these were the hypotheses that we were working on, that traumatic experience were likely to be described without being explicitly acknowledged, and that where trauma was explicitly acknowledged, it would mitigate sentencing, and that sentencing recommendations would be more likely to be trauma-informed. And we also hypothesized that there would be a gendered difference, with trauma more likely to be described, recognised, mitigating, and linked to trauma-informed recommendations for women. So we took a 10-year sample of homicide sentencing transcripts from Victoria's Supreme Court, selected all of the women, and then matched them to men. There were some exclusions, the cases that were not available to be examined. Obviously, there's a much higher proportion of male offenders to women offenders, which was why we did this kind of equal sampling technique. And this was the tool that I used to go through the transcripts and identify what sort of trauma people had been exposed to. Now, this is not an exhaustive list of all of the traumas that you can be subjected to. It's a bad day, certainly, but it doesn't cover some particularly important traumatics. I'm just going to put that out there from the get-go. It doesn't cover neglect, and it doesn't cover disrupted attachment, and it doesn't cover emotional abuse. And these are obviously really significant omissions when we're thinking about when we're thinking about things that violent offenders will have experienced in their lives. However, it gave us a list that was reasonably comprehensive, and this is the list of things that you can attribute PTSD to according to the DSM-5 criteria. So that's why I used this list. So then I went through this process of gathering data and scoring data so that we could understand who had been exposed to trauma, and then what the severity or multiplicity of that exposure was, whether or not the trauma was explicitly recognised or whether it was kind of recognised, whether PTSD existed, and then what the impact was on sentencing. So whether it was mitigating, whether it was aggravating, whether it was neither, but it was in some ways explanatory, or whether it was influential in another way, or whether it had no impact at all. I also collected data about the lengths of the sentence that offenders got. And then finally, we looked at whether or not sentencing recommendations, trauma-informed recommendations, were made. Yes. So this is the, there we go. So this is the sample that we ended up with. So we had 93 homicide offenders. Of these, 45 were female and 48 were male. All of them had been exposed to at least one traumatic item on the LEC 5, which is the exposure list. 7, however, had not been exposed to trauma other than their perpetration of violence. So those who read the list quickly will have noticed that item 16 is the perpetration of trauma, which is the serious injury, harm, or death that you cause to someone else. So obviously, given the nature of our sample, we know that everybody ticked the number 16. And just, with respect to the PTSD diagnosis, coming back to what I was harping on about before, only 20% of all of the offenders were diagnosed with PTSD. So they were all exposed, but they didn't all have PTSD, and that's important. So with respect to trauma exposure, the majority of the offenders were exposed to more than one trauma event. Only 7 were only exposed to item 16. Physical assault was the most commonly described trauma, with just over half of all offenders having been exposed, and 80% of those who had been exposed were multiply exposed. The next most common experience was sexual assault. About a third of all offenders had been exposed to sexual assault, and then assault with a weapon was the third most common exposure. Item 17 is the other category for trauma exposure, and it was pretty interesting. So these were the other things that people were exposed to. So for men, the most common other was immigration or a history of having been in a refugee camp or a detention centre, childhood separation from a father or separation from their own children. And then for women, separation from their own children. Over 25% of women were separated from a child, and that more or less fits with our statistics around women in custody. I think it's around about a third of women in custody are mothers. Immigration being the second, and then death of a close relative. And I think immigration, is particularly significant when we're thinking about Victoria, because it's the state that has the highest proportion of overseas born offenders, and we know that many of these many offenders who have got an experience of having been refugees or asylum seekers have had substantial trauma experiences. And there's also a call there for considering the cultural needs of this particular group of offenders who are not Australian by birth, many of whom are not Australian culturally either. With respect to women, again, just thinking about motherhood. In Australia, around about 80% of single parents are women, and so the separation from a child is particularly significant if you are the only parent or only caregiver that child has. And again, in Australia, where intergenerational trauma remains prominent, and not least amongst the 34% of Aboriginal women in prison, this finding raises complex issues regarding judicial decisions about offenders and their children, and the need for trauma-informed services for parents who are going to be separated from their children. Looking at this from the gendered perspective, there were significant gender differences with respect to trauma exposure. Women were significantly higher in their average trauma scores compared to men, and particular exposure to physical assault was significantly higher amongst female offenders when compared to men. Similarly, exposure to sexual assault was significantly higher amongst female offenders. I'll just kind of note here that this study looked at described rather than actual rates of trauma. Of course, it's really difficult to know whether or not other trauma had occurred, and the fact that women are being described to have had more trauma doesn't necessarily mean that the men aren't as traumatized. It's well established that that women at the time of sentencing, there's more of a leaning towards trying to find psychological reasons for offending, because women who offend are considered to be aberrant, rather than men who are just expected to be violent. And so in that case, accounts of trauma might be heuristically sought in order to confirm these intuitive assumptions that women are weak and that they're less dangerous. And again, because this also doesn't take into account neglect, which is particularly amongst male offenders, is considered to be a key factor along this traditional antisocial pathway into offending. So that's don't ever take these findings at face value. With respect to trauma recognition, so where exposure was described, trauma was only explicitly recognised, that is, somebody said, this is trauma, in 1/5 of the sample. And that percentage recognition for the big items, so the physical assault and the sexual assault, were 10% and 23% respectively. The recognition of traumatization for men and women was roughly equal, and sexual trauma appeared to be more frequently recognised for men, but the numbers were too low to be able to make anything of that. And when I was thinking about why this might be that these trauma were being described, and often described in quite sympathetic terms, but not explicitly acknowledged, I sort of wondered about a few things. So firstly, I wonder whether or not if an injury is particularly explicit, whether or not there's a tendency not to name it. So, if somebody walks into a room with their arm hanging off, then it seems unnecessary to say your arm is hanging off. Because that's, it's something that's more conspicuous. And I wonder if the same thing happens with trauma, that when we hear these extraordinary accounts of trauma, whether or not it's assumed that it's just a given, that the trauma has occurred. But what I would say is that no matter how sympathetic or compassionate the language around the description of trauma, trauma-informed sentencing principles tell us that we really should be explicitly naming it, because then that gives us a construct that can be acknowledged, which then permits a development of understanding. So it brings it to conscious attention so that it's something that can be understood and made an inquiry of. The impact on sentencing. So excluding item 16, trauma exposure appeared to impact on sentencing in around about 47% of the sample. So that is for about 47% of the trauma exposed sample. It was mitigating, aggravating, explanatory, or influential in some way. When the trauma was recognised, that is when it was explicitly recognised, i.e. in that 1/5 of the sample, it seemed to impact sentencing in about 80% of the cases, half of which it had a mitigating impact. Where the trauma wasn't recognised, i.e. the remaining 80% of the sample, it impacted sentencing in only 39% of the cases. And again, of those cases, about half of them, it was a mitigating effect. Trauma history was identified as being an obstruction to rehabilitation in 2 cases. And this is a sort of interesting finding, because you would think that trauma would be most likely to be mitigating, but actually this is something that's come out of some of the literature in capital cases in the US, that trauma is sometimes seen as being a static risk factor, so something that can't be changed. And so therefore, if you have a trauma history, it might actually work against you, because it's considered that you're going to be at an increased risk of offending because of that. There were some complications relating to making that connection between trauma and mitigation. there were two main groups where this was a bit tricky. The first ones were homicides of perpetrators of domestic violence. So one of the cases, the judge described the offenders having reduced moral culpability through an objectively reasonable response to the circumstances as the person perceives them. So that was a woman who was being violently victimized by her male partner, and who ultimately killed her male partner because she feared for her life. And the second group were traumatized offenders with a coexisting personality disorder. And this occurs at high rates, in offenders, and is causally linked to trauma. So again, this is another wider subject about whether or not personality disorder can be seen as mitigating. But if we acknowledge that trauma is associated with personality disorder, then it can get a bit difficult to identify what the relationship is between those and mitigation. But again, it's another presentation. With respect to trauma-informed recommendations, I don't imagine it will come as a big surprise that the results were disappointing. Specific recommendations were made for only 6 offenders, and non-specific recommendations were made for 11. Interestingly, of that total 17 for whom any recommendations were made at all, 8 of them were diagnosed with PTSD. And you'll remember that only 20% of the sample had PTSD. So it seems that there's a bit of a disproportionate recognition of the salience of trauma and the recommendations thereof for people who have PTSD. The trauma score, so now we're getting to really small numbers, so none of this is statistically valid, but it is interesting that the trauma score for offenders for whom trauma-informed recommendations were made were higher. So that is that the trauma exposure seemed to be higher for people for whom trauma-informed recommendations were made. And the trauma recognition scores for the group for whom trauma-informed recommendations were made were also higher. So what I'm saying is it looks like the trauma itself is associated, the description of the trauma is associated with an increased likelihood of trauma-informed recommendations, but it also looks like the recognition of trauma increases your likelihood of having trauma-informed recommendations. Of course, this is, again, it's all on a small number and more studies required to nut it out a bit better. Unfortunately, the trauma-informed recommendations were typically vague and non-evidence-based, so they included things like counselling, education programmes, all very non-specific. One case attributed therapeutic value to incarceration, that it would help you to break the cycle of drug abuse and domestic violence. And psychological treatment, again, counselling, a lot of it was non-specific and non-evidence-based. So, for example, identifying parole services as being a surrogate mature influence for those whose early life supervision was disrupted by abuse or other adversity. So not terribly satisfying recommendations. Here are the weaknesses of the study. You don't want to know those. We can gloss over those. I suppose the size of the study is the major one, and also the omissions that I fessed up earlier on. So, what were the conclusions? Well, the conclusions were that rates of trauma described at the point of sentencing for perpetrators of homicide in Victoria are high. Female offenders appear to be more exposed than their male counterparts. The explicit recognition of trauma in sentencing remarks was indeed confirmed to be low, and there were extremely low identification of trauma-informed recommendations, but it does seem that PTSD has a disproportionate effect on the likelihood of those recommendations being made, as opposed to just because of the experiences of trauma themselves. So these are the recommendations that were made by the paper. So I identified that further research and collaboration was necessary, and that we needed to source recommendations for evidence-based interventions to address trauma-related obstacles to rehabilitation, and that's a wide subject. And of course, that's not even taking into account the resource issues that we face when we're trying to provide for traumatised offenders. We identified that the development of judicial guidelines that would take into account trauma for the purposes of advising juries and guiding judges in sentencing were necessary. That the development of resilience and strength-based programs, which would be applicable to all offenders, and this is important, that we know that trauma is ubiquitous amongst offenders. We know that high proportions of offenders have trauma. And what we also know is that using trauma-informed approaches in courts, in corrections, it is associated with an improvement of all of the things that I spoke about a few slides ago, whether or not you know the details of that person's individual trauma. So if we treat everybody in a trauma-informed way, it's associated with these beneficial outcomes. You don't necessarily need to have all of the details about the trauma that one person has experienced. And then, of course, there's the issue of a wider societal response, which is something that's, again, particularly relevant for women, where we know that women tend to leave prison. And like Keith was saying before, they come in from a very shaky psychosocial situation. And then they are in prison for just long enough for everything to completely implode on the outside. And then they go out to a god-awful mess. They return into the circumstances where they're being victimized, or else their economic well-being is substantially compromised. Their families are more fragmented due to their absence. And they fall into this cycle of recidivism. Just thinking a little bit before we just finish, we're almost there, about what we might want to consider when we're thinking about trauma-informed justice and trauma-informed sentencing. So along several levels. So I suppose the individual level is thinking about how we interact with offenders, taking into account the fact that they have this increased likelihood of having been traumatized. Thinking about the position of the defendant in course. So one of the papers talked about having defendants sitting closer to the judge so that they wouldn't have to shout and they wouldn't have to be shouted at. Minimizing triggers, acknowledging that courts can be busy places and unexpected things can happen, unexpected noises can happen, the acoustics are a bit weird, and involving Aboriginal elders in Indigenous matters early on. Communicating in a way that's collaborative, thinking more about what happened to you, exploring the narrative rather than what's wrong with you, acknowledging that there are power imbalances and that the judicial process is going to often parallel past experiences, and taking a strengths-based approach whereby resilience is acknowledged. On the legal side of things, really it's going to fall to the defence lawyers to be the main drivers of trauma-informed justice. And again, they need to communicate with skill to traumatised defendants, doing a thorough exploration of trauma history. So not just speaking to the offender, but taking into account all of the information that's available and utilising expert witnesses such as psychiatrists and psychologists to gather information about the trauma, and then getting those expert witnesses to explain why the trauma is important and what the impact of that trauma might be behaviourally. Accommodating impediments of trauma. So many people who have had developmental trauma experiences might struggle with disclosure of information, trusting, and they might also have memory problems because of the nature of their PTSD in many cases. Recommendations for rehabilitation, so seeking out the opinions that tell judges actually what it is that needs to happen with this person. And of course, the cry is, yeah, but those resources are not in place. Why would we even recommend that somebody goes and sees a psychologist in prison when we know that they don't exist? But I think that this is where that steady exertion of pressure from the top down that says, okay, these resources aren't in place, but we're still recommending them. And we're going to keep on recommending them because it's actually what needs to happen for these people to be rehabilitated. Judges, it's about training, it's about judges accounting for trauma, it's about them being amenable to requests for resources to make trauma-informed sentencing mitigation work happen, and use of diversion, which you guys will know all about, and the application of therapeutic jurisprudence that we talked about before. Then we get on to policy, where we want to acknowledge this spectrum of trauma and its impacts. This slide is just outlining the ideals for trauma-informed service provision. Now, this is a list of 5 factors that was developed by non-criminal justice organisations or group. However, it gives us a sort of basis from which we can start thinking about how to develop trauma-informed policy for our setting. And probably the most important of these is empowerment, of people who've been traumatized, and then the correctional approach, which is something that I sort of touched on before, but I know that I'm running out of time. But I think one of the important things about this, and again, this comes from the Miller and Adjuvit's paper, is trying to draw from the expertise that are already in prison. There's draw upon that extant knowledge. Senior officers who've been working with prisoners for years, and they found ways intuitively of working with traumatized prisoners. So going in and drawing from that knowledge and really allowing experienced officers to lead that process of becoming more trauma informed, to avoid being dismissed as another bleeding heart. So draw out the expertise that's already there, and then provide the training and psychoeducation to better help them to deal with it. Incorporating peer voices, but again, just talking about headlines, not details. It can be traumatizing, as we know. It can be traumatizing for people to hear detailed trauma histories. So just being judicious in the way that we involve peers, and how much of that story we allow to come to the surface when we're supporting others. And these are the references. So thank you very much for your attention.
What a brilliant presentation. Thank you very much once again. I'm sure you'll be back again here.
Thank you. Thanks very much for inviting me. It's been wonderful.
And we look forward to the next one.